meeting Adele there on BBC Radio London. Bobby, how are you?
Good morning, Eddie. I'm very well. How are you this morning?
Listen, I'm fine. Listen, I'm really sorry because I get a feeling this subject might be a bit aggy, and I wish our first conversation was about something lovely, pleasant, sunny, and uplifting. Tell me a little bit about your housing travels through the years.
Okay, so this is a topic that I have a great deal of interest and knowledge in. So, in terms of background, I am a property investor, a developer. I have a property management company. I've been a renter, both in residential and commercial. So I bring a unique perspective in that vein because I've been on all sides of the table, so to speak. Just picking up a couple of points that were discussed earlier in your show. So I think the housing crisis that we have here in the UK is not unique to the UK. There isn't a country in the world that has more supply of housing than demand. Shortage of stock generally is a problem that we face everywhere. And I think sometimes the press have a habit of portraying landlords and housing associations in a negative impact and the tenants as the golden child.
It's not difficult when people got feces coming down their walls, when they've been waiting 18 months to get something. It's not really difficult for me to paint them as a villain then, is it?
Absolutely. And that in that particular case, that's absolutely unacceptable. But like in any industry, there are good and bad everywhere. You have amazing landlords, you have amazing tenants, but you have very bad tenants and very bad landlords. What the example you gave there is completely unacceptable. And I would say to you, in my experience,
as a what? Seen as you've been on all sides, in your experience, as what?
As an agent, having worked with a great many commercial and residential landlords, out of the number of years that we've been running our management company, this year is our 13th year, I would say there's only one landlord that we've come across that we would actually actively not work with. We didn't think he had the right ethos.
Well, maybe my critique is not of landlords. Maybe my critique is of you, or of the managers, of the management association. Because you see, we could talk about cities around the world. We could talk about countries where Germany, where it's predicated on renting. My constituency is London, so I do my best because I think that gives us, for me anyway, at 10 o'clock in the morning, it gives me a unique selling point. I am doing a show where I can, which is about London. Now, we'll have an in-depth conversation, you and I, about London, and about the housing market. So what I see London being the engine that drives the UK economy, and much of London's wealth predicated on housing. Let's discuss.
Okay, so let's pick up the London then, the fact that rents have been rising sharply. So the data shows that rents have been rising sharply, but it's in comparison to the most recent historical data. So if you compare rents over the last 6 months and a year or so, yes, they have shot up, but they've returned to what they were 2 years ago. Last year, during COVID, rents in London collapsed, 25-30% drops.
Well, hold on, 700,000 people left my city. Of course they collapsed.
Yes, and that was one of the reasons. And the other reason was we weren't getting tourists, and there was a whole combination of issues there. So rents did collapse last year, and that's why rents have returned back to where they were this year, because the demand is beginning to come back, both tourists and generally renters in London. So that kind of, in a very high level, summarizes why rents have shot up now. That doesn't mean they'll shoot up again next year. It's a correction. We had a correction last year, and it's re-correcting itself this year. So
do you think that people should have longer tenancies? Do you think that if I've got three children, and I've got my children into the local school, we've registered at the local GP, but I've only got 6 months, which seems to me to be 6 months and then another 6 months optional if I put the rent up or whatever. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. So again, in my experience, it's actually the tenants that want to move out more often than the landlord wants them moved out.
We'll find out, will we? That's a great one, because the great thing about talking to you, Bobby, and I won't interrupt you again, the great thing about talking to you is that people will hear us and they will tell us their own story of either I don't want to live here anymore, or my rent was put up, and therefore I had no choice. So that's a great one.
Yes.
What was your experience quickly of actually renting yourself? Because now you're a manager. I wonder whether you've forgotten about the tougher times. So, tell me about the tough times.
To be honest, I think, look, in my life, I've just tried to be fair with everyone. I try and explain the situation, whatever the problem is, and we work it out over a coffee table. I don't sit there making my demands and sticking to them. There needs to be flexibility. One thing I'll leave you with, a tenant and a landlord relationship, I always, and I still describe this as, a relationship akin to a marriage. So the landlord and the tenant are getting married for the term of their contract, whether that's an AST a year or a commercial lease 5 or 10 years. And you have to approach it like a marriage. You have to be willing to give and take a little bit here and there. The landlord wants certain things from the marriage. He wants you to look after the property and to pay your rent on time. And the tenant wants certain things. He wants the landlord to provide a safe and clean property and to deal with whatever his obligations are. And as long as you both work towards your individual obligations and there's a little bit of give and take, you will have a successful marriage in that respect.
If the power is not with the tenant, is it your assertion that actually what I'm doing is characterizing it incorrectly because the tenant has more power in your experience than the one that I'm painting?
So you are incorrect. The tenant doesn't have enough power. The Housing Act is what governs residential lettings. Commercial is governed by contract law. The Housing Act has swathes and swathes of sections that protect the tenant. It is very, very tenant-friendly already. And over the last few years, the Conservative government has implemented even more policies and legislation that favour the tenant. It is a misconception that tenants have no power.
Bobby, can you just give me a minute? I think it's a fantastic call, but what I normally do with the first time call is let them speak more than I've done. I've interrupted you a lot, and I don't want you to get off this phone having had our first conversation without thinking that you've had a fair crack. Can you give me 2 minutes and we go to travel and I'll come right back to you? Is that all right?
Yeah, sure,
okay.
Absolutely.
Okay, this is BBC Radio London. Two things we're talking about today. We're talking about housing associations, the kind of way that they are viewed, your experience of them. Clarion are coming on. They're the largest providers of this type of housing in the entire country. And also we're talking about the fact that rents have gone up by their fastest rate in 13 years. What that means, what the truth is behind that. Bobby's saying that they fell through the pandemic. They are merely correcting. It is like a marriage. We're having a conversation about the relationship between tenants and landlords. So renting and housing associations on our agenda. 0800 731 2000. I'll be back with you straight after we've heard what's happening on London's roads.
Thanks, Eddie. Will reopen in the next Medley Wood because of works. London on Thames and
BBC Radio London. Oz movie over there.
We take
the things that you come out with on your road.
Your lips, sweet moon, so sick. A game show, the virgin sister. I don't want it. In fact, I don't want to. Hey.
Right, Bobby, I know we don't know each other, but I need to make a contribution to our future and a moving forward relationship. So let me just explain to everybody. Bobby has given us a call in Loughton. Bobby has a panoramic view of a subject that we're discussing today. So quite often you take your weakness and make it your strength. I'd like to give you a variety of subjects, but two subjects struck me today. One was the fact that after our first intervention into the housing association debacle, as I call it, Clarion answered our call and agreed to come on today. So I'll be speaking to them. So ahead of them, I wanted to whet your appetite by talking to you about some of the challenges. And also we've discovered that renting has increased by its fastest rate in 13 years. Now, Bobby, which is great about being on a London radio station, has said, look, I know this story. This is one story I do know about, and I'm not sure, Eddie, that you're characterizing the story and the situation correctly. And we were in the middle of one of our things, but I personally didn't feel as though I gave you enough time to put your case properly because I was, I was challenged, and I was hurt, toxic masculinity and all of that. Let's start with, look, John has got involved in our conversation. John says, Bobby, I live in Luton, and they are moving people from London to here, which is Luton. Why are they moving families out of London who want to stay in the capital to Luton? Luton Council converting old office blocks to house people. These people working London, so why are they having to commute? And there is a thing, isn't there? Lots of councils will tell you off record that if there are places where you need more than 3 bedrooms, they're trying to ship you out to somewhere that you've never been and don't necessarily want to go to. What would you put that down to? And I know that's local authority stuff as opposed to the stuff we're talking about, but it kind of does come in the mix of housing, doesn't it?
I mean, that's an interesting one. And I sympathise with those families that are being asked to uproot from one location to another. But I think, look, if you look at it from a high-level perspective, let's try and take the emotion out of it here, because it sounds this whole conversation sounds quite emotive here.
Hold on. Yeah, I'll get it. So you trigger me, Bobby. It's you, it's not me. How can it not be emotional when your mental health, your food, the job that you do, the people that you see, your friendship groups, all of those are predicated on where you live? It is emotional, Bobby.
Yeah, listen, I totally agree. But for whatever reason, the housing isn't available in that location, and those people need to be housed, and that's the option that's on the table. Sometimes in my life, I've had to uproot. I've had things happen in my life that have forced me to be pushed in a completely different direction, and it was painful. It was hard initially, but in the long run, it was God's way of pushing me in somewhere where I needed to be. And I actually, in hindsight, am grateful for what happened. But at that time, it was the worst thing that could happen to me. I know I'm not trying to be insincere or inconsiderate of the example you've given, but I don't have a solution to that. I don't know what the solution is. I think I'd be recruited by the government as their best as are if I had the answer. Unfortunately, Eddie, I don't have the answer to that one.
The shortage, big picture stuff, the shortage is not planned? It's just the way it is, you think?
Look, our population's growing, demand is growing. We're an international city, so we get lots of travellers, but lots of guests from various parts of the world who want to live here, they want to stay here temporarily. Business is growing here, and that brings with it a greater demand for housing. We're a successful country, these things will happen. And like I said, there isn't a country in the world that has surplus of housing.
But there are many countries in the world that don't, first of all, farm out housing to people in other countries, to foreign investors, that it is the biggest cash cow, apart from how much my parking fine costs in the world. There are lots of countries that don't, you will have read reports of how, blocks are being offered abroad before they're being offered in this country. You always smell a rat when that sort of thing happens.
Eddie, that is happening. That happens quite a lot, and that happens particularly in. I'll tell you why that's happening, because the problem that happens, or the issues that happen, is land is sold at the highest possible price. Whoever the landowners are, sometimes they have very high expectations. In order to acquire that land, the builder, the developer, will overpay for land, which then means they've got to sell their apartments or homes for slightly more than they had expected. Build costs have gone up, especially over the last few years rather, especially since Brexit, and it's ramped up.
You're not allowed to use that word on the BBC. It's banned.
I know. I'm not a big fan, but anyway,
of the BBC
ultimately happens.
Sorry.
No, I do listen to you frequently, especially on my journeys around London in the traffic. That's a different conversation.
Yes, it is.
But the problem is that build costs and land costs is so high generally that developers build these flats and homes. And I'll be honest with you, the stuff they're selling abroad would never sell here in the UK at that price. The buyers here would never pay what they're able to achieve elsewhere. And the thing is, look, we are a global economy now, where it's not like the old days when I started out in business. where most of our business was domestic. Now it's a global market.
That's the problem. That's the problem, and that's the challenge with that. That's the challenge with the housing association. Well, it doesn't matter about it changing. Then look after the little people. Look after the person who's struggling, who reports something, and then has to go to their councillor, and then goes to their MP, and nothing gets changed until they come to people like me. That means they're not. And I live in a world where we're still, in my head, fresh Grenfell, which is where people said, hold on a minute, the housing association, management association, hold on a minute, this isn't right, these slights aren't right. And it didn't happen until those people died before anybody listened. So there is something happening about being grateful for social housing. Just finally, because everybody's getting involved in our conversation now, Bobby, another John wants to get involved, right? So here's the thing, right? He sent this. I don't know if it's true. I haven't fact-checked it now, which is something that wasn't around 15 years ago. Prime Ministers, presidents, radio presenters, everything being fact-checked. But here it goes. In 1961, 87% of house builds in Greater London was social housing, with 11% private and 2% other. In 2020, 7% of house builds in London was social housing, 89% private and 4% other. In the same period, the gap between the rich and the poor countrywide has trebled, which is why there is no surprise that people can barely afford to rent, let alone buy any more. And this is not me speaking, by the way, I'm still reading. The more people without long-term roof over their head, the more you will see society cohesion disappear. We are starting to see that now. An answer to John?
You'd like me to respond to that?
Yeah, well, you're our de facto correspondent today, so you might as well.
I would say, look, the period that you're talking about, things are very different then. We didn't have the internet, we didn't have mobile phones, we didn't lease, car availability was a lot less than it is now. The world was a different place back then. We're in this world now, and I think we should look forward as to what we can do now. The data is useful as a reference point, but looking forward, yes, I think the government could and should possibly build social housing. They try and put it on private landlords by making it part of their developments. But I think the government should, if the social housing is a strategy, then the government should be building more homes. But one point I'd like to say, because I know you're tight on time, is that some people, not everyone is suited to buying a home. I know we're all it's drilled into our head that we should all go and buy our home. But I spoke to a surveyor, and he said buying his home was the biggest mistake he ever made because of all the maintenance and running costs. He would have been, in his mind, better off renting because all the headache is on the landlord.
Speaking from personal experience, I didn't buy my house as a home. I bought it as an investment. And I'm ashamed to tell you that, but that is indeed the truth. You sound like one of those people I meet here who say to me, Eddie, why do you need a degree whilst they themselves have one? We'll do that. We'll talk. Bobby, can I keep your number? Because I've enjoyed reasoning with you. Instead of you shouting at the wireless while I'm on, having paid £1.50 for your diesel, we can talk in person. You've been fabulous. Look after yourself, Bobby. Take it easy. Bye-bye. Bobby.